In the grand theater of American history, some figures command the stage with a booming voice and an undeniable presence. They are the titans, the adventurers, the leaders whose shadows stretch across generations. Theodore Roosevelt was one such man, a force of nature, a whirlwind of ambition, energy, and unshakable conviction. His life was a public spectacle, and he wanted it that way. But what happens when you are born into the heart of that storm, yet your own nature is one of quiet observation? What is it like to be the daughter of the loudest man in America, and yet be known for your silence? We think we know the Roosevelts, the boisterous boys, the daring cousins, the charge up San Juan Hill, the trust-busting, the larger-than-life legend. But nestled within that epic saga is a story of profound resilience, quiet duty, and heartbreaking loss that is rarely ever told. This isn't the story of a president or a general. This is the story of the one who stayed behind to pick up the pieces, the one who remembered. This is the story of Edith Roosevelt, Jr., the president's daughter, who, far from the spotlight she so carefully avoided, lived a life of extraordinary courage and quiet significance. And to understand her, we must first step back into the world that created her, a world of immense privilege and even greater pressure. The turn of the 20th century was an age of explosive change in America. The Gilded Age, with its staggering wealth and desperate poverty, was giving way to the Progressive Era. It was a time of invention, of ambition, of a nation flexing its muscles on the world stage for the first time. And at the very center of this transformation was the Roosevelt family. Their home at Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay, New York, wasn't just a house. It was a character in their family's story. It was a chaotic, rambling hub of activity filled with books, hunting trophies, and the constant thundering footsteps of 6 children. This was the world Edith Carow Roosevelt, the president's second wife, carefully curated. She was the calm, intelligent anchor to her husband's whirlwind. While Theodore, or TD, as he was known to family, was out chasing cowboys or politicians, Edith was creating a sanctuary of order and intellectual rigor. Into this world, on August 10, 1891, was born their first daughter, also named Edith. Edith Roosevelt, Jr., born Ethel Carow Roosevelt on August 13, 1891, in Oyster Bay, New York, was the only daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt and his second wife, Edith Carow Roosevelt. Growing up in one of America's most prominent political families, Edith Jr.'s childhood was a unique blend of privilege, intellectual stimulation, and the constant presence of national affairs, setting her apart from her rambunctious brothers while preparing her for a life of grace and duty. As the second child in the family, following her half-sister Alice from Theodore's first marriage, and alongside brothers Theodore Jr., Kermit, Archibald, and Quentin, Edith Jr. navigated a household filled with energy and expectations. Her early years were shaped by the family's residences, from Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay to the White House during her father's presidency from 1901 to 1909. This period, marked by her father's strenuous life philosophy, highlighted Edith Jr.'s distinct personality, studious, observant, and reserved, in contrast to her siblings' boisterous nature. Edith Jr.'s earliest years were spent in the idyllic setting of Sagamore Hill, the Roosevelt family estate in Oyster Bay, Long Island, a sprawling 23-room Victorian mansion set on 83 acres of rolling hills and woodlands overlooking Long Island Sound. Purchased by Theodore Roosevelt in 1884, the property served as the family's primary home outside of Washington, D.C., and was a hub of activity that blended rustic outdoor life with intellectual pursuits. Born just a year after her brother Kermit, Edith Jr. was immersed in a household where her father's love for nature and adventure was a daily influence. Theodore Roosevelt, often called TR, instilled in his children a philosophy of the strenuous life, emphasizing physical vigor, moral courage, and intellectual curiosity. However, from infancy, Edith Jr. exhibited a temperament that diverged from her brother's high-energy antics. Accounts from family letters and diaries, such as those preserved in the Theodore Roosevelt papers at the Library of Congress, describe her as a calm, introspective baby who preferred quiet observation over the noisy play of her siblings. Her mother, Edith Kermit Roosevelt, a reserved and cultured woman from a prominent New York family, played a significant role in nurturing this disposition. Edith Sr. was known for her love of literature and the arts, often reading to her children from classics like Shakespeare and Dickens, fostering in Edith Jr. an early affinity for books that would earn her the nickname the family bookworm. The Roosevelt household was far from ordinary, with Sagamore Hill serving as a playground for the children's imaginations and a venue for their father's impromptu lessons in history and natural science. Edith Jr.'s brothers, Theodore Jr., Kermit, Archibald, and Quentin, formed what was dubbed the White House Gang during their father's presidency, notorious for their pranks such as sliding down banisters, hiding snakes in guest beds, or even smuggling a pony into the White House elevator. These exploits were chronicled in newspapers like the New York Times, which in 1903 reported on the boys' mischievous adventures with a mix of amusement and exasperation, noting how they embodied their father's vigorous spirit. In contrast, Edith Jr., as the only full sister among them, was often the quiet mediator, adored and protected by her brothers. Family correspondence, including a 1902 letter from Theodore Roosevelt to his sister Corinne, describes Edith Jr. as "my blessed baby," a term of endearment that highlighted her special place in his heart. At age 11 during this period, she was portrayed as thoughtful and composed, preferring to curl up with a book in the library while her brothers wrestled or explored the woods. This dynamic is further illustrated in The Roosevelt Children by Edward Renahan, 2007, which draws from archival materials to depict Edith Jr. as the family's steady center, providing emotional balance amid the chaos. The family's move to the White House in 1901, following President William McKinley's assassination, thrust Edith Jr. into the national spotlight at age 10, amplifying the unique aspects of her childhood. While her brother's pranks made headlines, such as Archie and Quentin's snowball fights with diplomats, as detailed in a 1904 New York Herald article that amused readers with tales of presidential pandemonium, Edith Jr. was often noted for her composure. Contemporary reports in the Ladies' Home Journal, 1903, described her as the quiet Roosevelt, frequently seen in the White House library with volumes of history or literature, absorbing knowledge that would later inform her adult pursuits. Her father's influence was profound. Theodore Roosevelt, a prolific reader and writer, encouraged her studies, gifting her books like The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling, which she treasured, as mentioned in her later recollections compiled in the Roosevelt family archives at the Library of Congress. This environment honed her observational skills, making her a keen student of human behavior, a trait that served her well in social settings. Edith Jr.'s education was tailored to prepare her for a life as a society woman, reflecting the era's expectations for young ladies of her class. She attended private schools in Washington, D.C., including the Cathedral School for Girls a prestigious Episcopal institution known for its emphasis on academics, etiquette, and languages. Enrollment records from the school, preserved in the National Cathedral Archives, show her excelling in French, Latin, and literature, with teachers noting her exceptional aptitude for languages in reports dated 1905. Unlike her brothers, who were groomed for public service and adventure, Ted Jr. attending Groton School and later Harvard, Kermit exploring the Amazon, Edith Jr.'s curriculum focused on the arts, music, and domestic skills, such as embroidery and household management, as was customary for upper-class girls. Family letters from Edith Sr. to relatives, available in the Theodore Roosevelt Center at Dickinson State University, reveal her mother's insistence on a balanced education, including horseback riding and tennis to align with the family's active lifestyle. Though Edith Jr. preferred quieter activities like reading poetry by Wordsworth or Tennyson. By age 15 in 1906, she was fluent in French and German, skills that facilitated her correspondence with European relatives and prepared her for diplomatic social circles. As Edith Jr. approached adolescence, the family's return to Sagamore Hill in 1909 after Theodore's presidency allowed for a more private upbringing. At age 18 in 1909, she was on the cusp of adulthood, with her education shifting toward preparation for marriage and society. She attended finishing schools in New York, such as Miss Chapin's School, where curricula emphasized deportment, art, and literature. As documented in school alumni records from the New York Historical Society, these institutions, catering to elite families, focused on grooming young women for roles as wives and mothers, with classes in flower arranging, menu planning, and foreign languages. Edith Jr. excelled, her teachers praising her intellectual curiosity in reports from 1910. She also learned piano and harp, performing at family gatherings as recalled in her brother Archibald's memoirs, For Better or Worse, 1951, where he described her as the musical soul of the family. Edith Jr.'s social debut in 1910 at age 19 was a highlight of her premarital life, a rite of passage for young women of her class. Held in the East Room of the White House, courtesy of her father's enduring influence, the event was a glittering affair, attended by 500 guests from Washington's elite, including diplomats, senators, and socialites. As reported in the Washington Post on December 15, 1910, the debut featured formal dances like the cotillion, with Edith Jr. wearing a white satin gown by Worth of Paris, its bodice embroidered with pearls and a train of tulle, symbolizing purity and elegance. The East Room, decorated with white roses and ferns, echoed with orchestra music as she was introduced to society. This debut, costing an estimated $5,000, about $150,000 today, was not merely a party but a strategic launch into the marriage market where alliances were forged through courtship. And it was during this gilded chapter of her life that she met a young, promising surgeon from a distinguished Boston family, Dr. Richard Darby. Their courtship was proper, their connection genuine. They shared a sense of duty, a seriousness of purpose that perhaps set them apart from the more frivolous members of their social set. They were married in 1913, a beautiful wedding at Christ Church in Oyster Bay. It seemed her path was set. She was Mrs. Richard Darby, poised to live a comfortable, privileged life, raising a family in the shadow of her famous name, but safely removed from its direct glare. History, however, had other plans. In the summer of 1914, the intricate web of European alliances snapped, and the world plunged into the Great War. For most Americans, it was a distant conflict, a European problem. But for the Roosevelts, it was a call to action. Theodore Roosevelt, now out of office, was one of the loudest voices demanding American intervention. He railed against President Woodrow Wilson's neutrality, calling it cowardly. For him and for his sons, war was not something to be avoided. It was the ultimate test of character, the highest form of service. As the United States eventually entered the war in 1917, all four of his sons immediately enlisted and went to France. Ted Jr., Kermit, and Archie all served on the front lines, distinguishing themselves with the kind of reckless bravery their father had mythologized. The youngest, Quentin, a bright and beloved spirit, joined the fledgling Army Air Service to become a pilot. The Roosevelt men were all in. And what of Edith, the quiet daughter? She was a wife and soon to be a mother. Her husband, Dr. Darby, as a skilled surgeon, was also called to serve. He joined the American Expeditionary Forces and was sent to France to head a frontline surgical hospital. By all accounts, Edith's duty was to stay home, to wait, to worry, to write letters, and to pray. But that was not the Roosevelt way, not even for the quietest of them. In a decision that reveals the core of steel beneath her serene exterior, Edith refused to remain on the sidelines. Leaving her infant son in the care of her mother, she sailed for France in 1918. She didn't go as a society patron or a visiting dignitary. She went to work. Ethel's involvement in World War I predated America's entry, beginning in September 1914, when she accompanied her husband, Dr. Richard Darby, to France to volunteer with the American Ambulance Hospital in Neuilly-sur-Seine, a suburb of Paris. The hospital, established by American expatriates in August 1914, shortly after the war's outbreak, was a critical facility for treating wounded soldiers from the Western Front, equipped with 600 beds and staffed by volunteer surgeons and nurses from the United States. Ethel, trained as a nurse through Red Cross courses in New York prior to departure, arrived amid the chaos of the First Battle of the Marne, where French and British forces halted the German advance. Historical records from the American Hospital of Paris archives indicate that Ethel began her duties immediately, assisting in surgical wards where the influx of casualties, often with shrapnel wounds, gas poisoning, and amputations, overwhelmed the staff. Her initial role involved basic nursing tasks such as changing dressings, administering morphine for pain relief, and providing comfort to patients, many of whom were young French poilus, infantrymen, barely out of their teens. The adjustment to this environment was profoundly difficult for Ethel, who had lived a sheltered life of privilege. Prior to 1914, her days were filled with social engagements, reading, and family activities at Sagamore Hill or in Washington, D.C. Now at 23, she faced 12-hour shifts in a hospital where the air was thick with the smells of ether, blood, and infection. Letters she wrote to her family, preserved in the Theodore Roosevelt papers at the Library of Congress, reveal the emotional strain. In a September 1914 note to her mother, Ethel described the endless rows of beds filled with broken men, noting how the constant moans and the sight of gangrenous limbs made sleep nearly impossible. The hospital's conditions were rudimentary, overcrowded wards with limited sanitation, where nurses like Ethel had to improvise with scarce supplies, such as using boiled rags for bandages when gauze ran out. Reports from the American Red Cross, published in the New York Times in October 1914, highlighted the volunteers' efforts, mentioning Ethel's tireless dedication in caring for over 50 patients daily during peak casualty waves. As the war progressed and America's entry loomed, Ethel's responsibilities expanded. By 1916, with the Battle of Verdun raging, she began driving ambulances for the Red Cross, a perilous task that involved navigating shell-pocked roads near the front lines. The ambulances, often Ford Model T chassis modified with canvas tops, were unreliable in the mud of northern France, requiring drivers to repair flats or push vehicles through quagmires while under threat of artillery fire. Ethel's letters to her brother Kermit, dated March 1916, describe a night run where she transported 20 wounded soldiers from a field hospital near Soissons to Paris, a 50-mile journey that took 8 hours due to road conditions and enemy shelling. She wrote of the deafening roar of guns and the heart-wrenching cries of the injured, experiences that left her physically exhausted and emotionally drained. These runs, sometimes conducted in blackout conditions to avoid detection, exposed her to the constant risk of injury or death. A Red Cross report from 1916 noted that several ambulance drivers, including Americans, were killed by shrapnel during similar missions. The psychological whiplash Ethel experienced was acute. Raised in the protected splendor of the White House from 1901 to 1909, where her debut in 1910 was a swirl of silk gowns and formal dances in the East Room, she was now immersed in the charnel house of the Western Front. Family correspondence, such as a 1917 letter to her father Theodore, reveals her internal conflict. The contrast between the life I knew and this endless horror is almost too much to bear. Theodore, a staunch advocate for American intervention, had championed the war as a noble cause, but Ethel's first-hand accounts provided a grim counterpoint. She described the mud-choked roads where ambulances bogged down, forcing her to help carry stretchers through knee-deep sludge, and the hospital wards filled with the stench of antiseptic, gangrene, and death. These details, drawn from her wartime diary excerpts published in The Roosevelt Family in World War I by Edward Renahan, 2007, illustrate the daily grind, sterilizing instruments by boiling them in scarce water, rationing morphine amid supply shortages, and consoling soldiers who begged for letters to their families. When the United States declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917, Ethel's role evolved from volunteer to an integral part of the American Expeditionary Force's medical support. With America's involvement, the American Red Cross expanded its operations, and Ethel, already experienced, was assigned to more frontline duties. She and her husband, Richard Darby, a surgeon who headed a unit at the American Ambulance Hospital, relocated closer to the action, working in field hospitals near the Aisne-Marne sector. Red Cross records from the National Archives indicate that Ethel drove over 1,000 miles in ambulances during 1917, transporting more than 500 wounded soldiers. The roads, cratered by shell fire and turned to mud by incessant rain, made each trip a hazard. A June 1917 entry in her diary describes a convoy where her ambulance overturned in a ditch, requiring her to help extricate patients under gunfire, resulting in minor injuries to her arm from shrapnel. The emotional toll was equally severe. Ethel held the hands of dying soldiers. Many the age of her brothers, Ted Jr. and Kermit, were serving in the U.S. Army by mid-1917, adding personal anxiety. In a letter to her mother dated July 1917, preserved at the Theodore Roosevelt Birthplace National Historic Site, she wrote of grievously wounded boys who cry for their mothers, describing how she stayed with a 19-year-old infantryman from Ohio as he succumbed to gas gangrene, whispering comforts until the end. These experiences, far from the tea parties and debut balls of her youth, forced her to confront the war's futility, a stark contrast to her father's rhetoric of noble combat. Theodore Roosevelt's letters to her, such as one from August 1917 in the Library of Congress, encouraged her with phrases like, "Keep up the good fight," But Ethel's responses revealed growing disillusionment. The glory Father speaks of seems distant amid the endless suffering. Hospital work presented its own horrors. At the American Ambulance Hospital, which expanded to 1,000 beds by 1917, Ethel assisted in surgeries, holding retractors during amputations, or cleaning wounds infested with maggots, a deliberate medical practice to eat dead tissue. Contemporary accounts in the American Journal of Nursing, 1918, detail the nurses' 14-hour shifts, with Ethel noted for her unflinching composure in operating rooms where surgeons performed up to 20 procedures a day. The psychological strain manifested in fatigue and nightmares. A family friend, quoted in the Roosevelts, An Intimate History by Jeffrey C. Ward and Ken Burns, 2014, recalled Ethel confiding that the screams haunt me even in sleep. Despite this, she persisted, earning the Croix de Guerre from the French government in 1918 for her service, as reported in the New York Times on March 15, 1919, which praised her devotion under fire. The war's most devastating blow came on July 14, 1918, when Ethel's youngest brother, Quentin Roosevelt, a 20-year-old aviator in the U.S. Army Air Service, was shot down over German lines near Chamery, France. Quentin, the baby of the family, had been Ethel's particular favorite, their close age difference fostering a sibling bond akin to twins. News of his death reached the family via telegram, as documented in Theodore Roosevelt's correspondence at Harvard's Houghton Library, plunging them into grief. Ethel, stationed in Paris at the time, was among the first to learn the details from military reports, which described Quentin's plane being hit by machine gun fire during a dogfight, crashing behind enemy lines. The news took days to reach the family. Her husband, Richard, had to break the news to her in that hospital in France. At the very moment she was surrounded by the anonymous suffering of war, that suffering was given a face she knew and loved more than almost any other. Her baby brother was gone. One can only imagine the profound soul-crushing agony of that moment. She had to grieve in a place where grief was the common currency, surrounded by the moans of other mothers' sons. This loss compounded Ethel's hardships, transforming her wartime service into a period of profound sorrow. Back home, at Sagamore Hill, a reporter came to the door to ask Theodore Roosevelt for a comment on the unconfirmed reports of Quentin's death. The former president, the symbol of American strength, simply said, "Quentin's dead?" He then turned and walked back inside, a broken man. He would later write, "It is foolish to protest against the decrees of fate," but the light had gone out of his eyes. He died himself only 6 months later, and the family always believed he died of a broken heart. For Edith, the war's end was not a celebration. It was the beginning of a lifetime of carrying its scars. She returned to America a changed woman. She had seen the very worst of humanity, but she had also demonstrated the very best of it through her own quiet service. She and her husband settled into a life far from the political arena in Oyster Bay, near the family home of Sagamore Hill. They would have 4 children in total, and on the surface they lived a normal, upper-class American life. But the specter of tragedy was never far from the Roosevelts. The war had lit a fuse of loss that would burn for decades. The family's story, which seems so triumphant from a distance, becomes almost unbearably sad when you look closer. This is where we encounter a central, unspoken controversy of the Roosevelt legacy, one that Edith lived at the very center of. Was the family's relentless pursuit of the strenuous life, their unyielding code of duty and sacrifice, a source of noble strength or a kind of curse? Theodore Roosevelt had taught his children that there was no higher calling than to risk everything for honor and country. Better 1,000 times to die gloriously than to shirk the duty of the great days, he wrote. His sons took this to heart. They lived in the shadow of a legend, constantly striving to measure up. Archie, her second youngest brother, was grievously wounded in World War I, his body shattered by an artillery shell. He survived, but lived with constant pain for the rest of his life. He re-enlisted for World War II and was wounded again, becoming the only American to be awarded the same disability rating for wounds in both World Wars. Kermit, the adventurous and sensitive brother, had fought with distinction in both the British and American armies in World War I. But the horrors he witnessed, combined with a lifelong struggle with depression and alcoholism, what some biographers call the family's black dog, proved too much. During World War II, while serving in Alaska, he took his own life in 1943. It was another devastating blow, shrouded in the quiet shame of the era. And then there was Ted Jr., the eldest, who had always felt the pressure to live up to his father's name most acutely. He was a decorated hero of the First War, and in the Second, as a 56-year-old brigadier general suffering from a heart condition and arthritis, he insisted on landing with the first wave of troops at Utah Beach on D-Day. He famously walked the beaches with a cane, rallying the terrified young soldiers, redirecting the landing and saving countless lives. It was an act of almost suicidal courage. He survived the landing, but just over a month later, he died of a massive heart attack in his cot in Normandy. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Think of Edith, the quiet sister, the one who had nursed the wounded. She had lost one brother to enemy fire, one to suicide, and now the eldest to the immense strain of living up to the family code. Only Archie was left, twice wounded but still standing. Through all of this, Edith remained the steady, silent presence. She didn't write blistering memoirs or give public interviews about her family's pain. Her grief was private, dignified, and profound. While the world saw the heroic narrative, the Roosevelts who always answered the call, she saw the intimate, human cost. She saw the empty chairs at the dinner table, the widows, the children left behind. She understood in a way few could that the price of glory was paid in flesh and blood and sorrow. This isn't to say she was opposed to the family's ethos of service. On the contrary, she embodied it in her own way. But her service was different. It was not on the battlefield or in the political arena. It was in the quiet, essential work of preservation and care. After her mother's death in 1948, Edith became the unofficial matriarch of the Roosevelt clan. She took on the immense task of preserving the family's legacy, not the public myth, but the private reality. She and her sister Ethel were instrumental in the effort to preserve Sagamore Hill as a national historic site, ensuring that the chaotic, loving home that shaped them would be saved for future generations. Her most personal and revealing project was the editing and publishing of her mother's letters. In 1954, she co-edited a volume titled The Letters of Edith Kermit Roosevelt. This was not a hagiography. It was a careful, loving act of memory. Through this work, she gave the world a glimpse of the woman who was the quiet heart of the family, the one who managed the president, the children, and the household with such intelligence and grace. In telling her mother's story, she was also, in a way, telling her own. She was championing the value of the quiet contributor, the steady hand behind the scenes. There's a little-known anecdote that perfectly captures her character. Late in her life, she dedicated herself to a cause that received no headlines, helping the blind. She worked tirelessly with the Blind Brook Club, an organization dedicated to providing assistance and companionship to the visually impaired. It was humble, hands-on work, far from the national stage. A reporter once asked her why she did it. She seemed almost surprised by the question as if the answer was self-evident. She simply said it was something that needed doing. There was no grand philosophy, no quest for recognition. It was duty, plain and simple, translated into quiet compassion. This was her version of the strenuous life, not charging up a hill but steadily, patiently, helping someone navigate a world of darkness. The historical significance of Edith Roosevelt Darby is not found in any single dramatic act. You won't find her name attached to a piece of legislation or a famous battle. Her importance lies in the counter-narrative she represents. In a family famous for its sound and fury, she signifies the power of silence. In a culture that increasingly celebrates celebrity and self-promotion, her life is a testament to the dignity of privacy and the value of quiet, consistent service. She reminds us that for every hero in the spotlight, there are countless others tending to the wounds, preserving the memories, and holding things together. She represents the strength of endurance, not just the strength of action. While her brothers sought to make history, she sought to understand and preserve it in all its painful complexity. She lived through an era of immense upheaval, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the dawn of the atomic age, and she met it not with her father's bluster, but with her mother's fortitude. She bore witness to the hollowing out of her own family by war and ambition. Can you imagine the emotional weight she carried? The last surviving child of Theodore and Edith's brood, she outlived them all, carrying the memories of Quentin, Kermit, and Ted Jr. with her every day. She was the repository of a generation of laughter, love, and unspeakable loss. Edith passed away in 1971 at the age of 79 and was buried in Oyster Bay surrounded by the family she had so steadfastly loved and served. Her life never garnered the same attention as her relatives. There are no soaring monuments to her, but perhaps her legacy is more subtle and in some ways more enduring. Her life asks us to look past the headlines and into the heart of history. It invites us to consider the different forms that courage can take. There is the courage of the soldier, which is undeniable, but there is also the courage of the nurse who stays at her post, the courage of the sister who endures wave after wave of grief without breaking, the courage of the Pullman who dedicates her life to ensuring that those she loved are not forgotten. Edith Roosevelt Jr.'s story is not about changing the world. It's about holding a world together while it threatens to fly apart. She was the anchor in the storm, the quiet guardian of a loud and legendary name. In the grand, tumultuous saga of the Roosevelts, filled with adventure and tragedy on a monumental scale, her life was a quiet, steady flame of duty, love, and remembrance. And that is a story worth telling, and most certainly a life worth remembering.